We are all being tested. Here we are, testing our ability. Here we are, testing our ability. See, I didn't know God. I was too down. I was too far down. Crawling around on my knees. I was ready to go. I was ready to go. I said, testing, you may lay right there. You may stand right there. Get out on your knees and crawl right there. Sucking back, sucker. That's to see how much in a lifetime I could do. That kept me testing out, just testing you.
Many of you will know what I mean when I say Joyce Lindy would have loved that, and I was sitting there thinking of her. My name is Matthew Teitelbaum. I'm the director of your MFA, even the folks from Maine. This is your MFA, just saying it. It's wonderful to be partners with the Colby Museum of Art. It's wonderful to be amongst friends, supporters, scholars, collectors, believers in thinking about art in new ways. So I'm really glad to welcome you. Our promise is to be an institution where all belong. And one of the ways to do that is to open up definitions of art and to recognize the artistic spirit in everyone. So tonight is a special night for us. It's the first public program resulting from the museum's folk art initiative, something that Joyce generously supported. It was developed, in fact, in close partnership with Joyce, who was a long-serving trustee and a visionary philanthropist. Her vision was to support an institution-wide effort, quote, to make the MFA a thought leader in the interpretation and display of artwork historically labeled as folk art. And working closely with us, we came up with 4 key goals: to raise awareness, invite conversation, and enhance visitor engagement, to inspire cultural understanding and creativity, to diversify our collection, and to challenge the definition of what is art and who can be an artist. Her investment in the MFA, her belief in the MFA, created a new curatorial position in the Art of the Americas Department and the Joyce Lindy Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art. And I'm pleased to say that Michael, who is going to lead us in a large part of today, Michael Bramwell, is our new Joyce Lindy Endowment for Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art. And I want to say to Michael, you should say that you're new for as long as possible, because it really sort of gives you scope to, do stuff. I want to say again that working with Colby College is a dream for us. Great partners. Jackie, great partners. More. And the Lunder Institute at the Museum of Fine Art Boston program is co-presented by the Lunder Institute for American Art, a part of the Colby Museum of Art. And Lunder Institute invites institutions to be in conversation with one another and challenge them to look critically at what is American art and its history, its future, and its evolution. And we're really pleased to be part of that journey. And I'm so glad that so many people are here from Colby. So here's the secret. Erica Wall, great colleague, used to work in the basement of the MFA. And she told me that it was a formative experience for her and how pleased she is to be out of the basement, and so are we. So Erica is the director of the Lunder Institute of American Art at Colby College. She assumed this role in 2022 after many years of work in arts and culture at several museums. Thrilled to welcome you, Erica, but just to say you made an impact here, you're still beloved here, and I'm sure the same is true at Colby College. So with great pleasure, Erica Wall.
That was a joke. I really didn't think he was going to use that. He got me. So good evening, everyone. My name is Erica Wall, and I am the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art, part of the Colby College Museum of Art at Colby College in beautiful Waterville, Maine. It is a bit of a homecoming for me. As Matthew said, I worked here very, very early in my career as head of school and teacher programs. I was about 10 years old, and then, child labor laws hit, but it was very formative. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm super excited and so grateful that everyone is part of the fifth of 6 programs that Lunder Institute at this year. The Lunder Institute for American Art is, for all intents and purposes, a think tank. It also serves a unique function as a compass. And I say that because it is a compass that does not just point us to one North Star, but a galaxy of stars that have yet to be explored and those that have not been explored enough. And so with that, we seek relevant questions that prompt and sustain this exploration. So to ask the question, what is the state of American art, is to ask the question, what is the state of America, regionally, nationally, and globally, and to look at that in terms of how it reflects in our discourse, our research, our scholarship, and our art production. And as we know, art institutions such as this play a critical role in how we as the public understand this, and we work with the public to understand this. Lunder Institute was in fact intended to create a vehicle for institutions to be in conversation, but also a place for them to be in conversation for and with the public. This particular program was conceived during a brief conversation with Michael Bramwell, the inaugural Joyce Lindy Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art, and it was our first conversation, and obviously of many that brought us here this evening, so I want to specifically thank Michael for his collaboration. I want to thank the Museum of Fine Art Boston for being in conversation and partnership with the Lunder Institute for American Art, and I want to specifically thank Matthew Teitelbaum as director, as well as the amazing staff of program partners, starting with Ethan Lasser, John Moore's Cabot Chair, Art of the Americas, and his team, Kristen Hoskins, Director of Public Programs, and her team, Carly Biederman, Department Coordinator, Art of the Americas, and Kelly Hayes, Director, Gifts of Art, for collaborating, designing, designing and implementing what I am sure to be a spectacular program tonight. But what I want to do is express my deepest gratitude to Peter and Paula Lunder, and I'm so thrilled that Peter is here with us tonight to experience this for the first time, and the Lunder Foundation for making the Lunder Institute for American Art possible, but also for creating this unique platform that builds communities and benefits not just the Colby College community, but as we can see here tonight, communities that go beyond our borders. And so with that, I want to thank you again all for joining us, and I'm going to hand the podium off to Michael Bromwell. Enjoy the evening.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Bramwell. I'm the Joyce Lindy Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art here at the MFA Boston. And the first thing I'd like to do is welcome all of you to our symposium this evening, New Discourses on Folk and Self-Taught Art. I'd like to thank Matthew and Erica for their opening remarks, and the Lunder Institute and Colby Museum of Art for the opportunity to collaborate on this symposium, which is part of the public program component of the Folk Art Initiative at the MFA. And to my partners who have traveled from Washington, D.C., California, North Carolina, and Georgia to be here this evening, thank you very much. And then also my colleagues in the Art of the Americas and in the museum-wide community. But most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for being composed of collectors, dealers, curators, artists, writers, academics, scholars, art critics, museum professionals, benefactors, art enthusiasts, and the general public for your presence here this evening, which evinces a community of practice that both values and validates this American art form. Now, I know this firsthand because so many of you registered for this symposium this evening that we had to change venues. That shows enthusiasm, and for that I thank you. But tonight, what I'd like you to do, and I encourage you to actively listen as my collaborators share their expertise and experience while staying alert for ideas that can help us think anew beyond regressive categories of insider and outsider, mainstream and marginal, self-taught and academically trained. This symposium comes at an important moment in American cultural history in which people, institutions, and society at large are making true motions toward being more inclusive, more diverse, and more equitable in their interaction with others. By allowing access to previously marginalized voices and art forms, we are opening up and expanding the boundaries of American art. The goal now is to develop a cultural competence that allows us to recognize and value differences in people and art alike. And this folk art designation will disappear the more we integrate this art form with other art forms. There's an old saying that art is known by the company it keeps, and we want to keep company with all the genres of American art. At the MFA, we're committed to this progressive way of thinking that's embedded in our institutional goal of here all belong. This is a new vision for what social justice can look like in cultural space. I'd like to read two quotes to you that will sort of frame tonight's presentation. And one is by the late creative believer and artist and Baptist minister Howard Finster from Georgia. He said, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, there ain't no outsiders of anything. If you're an artist, you're an artist. If you're a mechanic, you're a mechanic. And if you're a farmer, you're a farmer. There ain't no outsider farmers. There ain't no outsider mechanics. That's just something someone made up to class people. I ignore it. The next quote is by a living self-taught artist who's here with us tonight, Mr. Lonnie Holly. He was quoted as saying, quote, "I didn't want to be outside of nothing. We've been considered to be outsider quicker than we've been considered to be artists in America. I wanted to be an American artist. All those titles fitted me like an ill-fitting suit. I wore it proudly because there was nothing else for me to wear and nothing else for me to put on at the time. But otherwise, I want people to see me as a great American artist." Tonight, you will hear from Dr. Berlinger, a folklorist and an ethnologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who will focus on labels and the limits, and Kinkasha Holman Conwell, an artist and Deputy Director Emerita of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and former Director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. She will look at how the term self-taught is really a journey of naming and remembering. And Jory Finkel, an art writer and New York Times critic who has thought a lot and written about how to right the ship of American art. And Lonnie Holly, musician, poet, and who is indeed a part of the wonder of this great American art form. But right now, let me get out of the way and let you hear from one of our colleagues, Dr. Gabrielle Berlinger.
Good evening, everyone. This is such a pleasure. Thank you so much to Michael and to everyone at the MFA for making this opportunity exist and for inviting me to be part of the conversation with all these wonderful individuals. It's a true privilege. So I am delighted to be here today because as a folklorist, I have always moved between academic and museum worlds. In both realms, I've been fascinated by the creation, the preservation, the use, and the interpretation of material things. I've studied the making of things and the stories of their making, which create meaning for people in everyday life. This is the field of folklore, but often people hear the word folklore and imagine its borders surround only fairy tales or only quilts. The academic field of folklore, however, encompasses all expressions of traditional knowledge and practice. Folklorists believe that all people are creative communicators in their everyday lives, and through different modes of expression, such as storytelling, dancing, occupational work, religious belief, architectural practice, cooking, dress, and visual and plastic arts, to name a few forms, individuals communicate experience and worldview as they engage with the people, materials, and environments that surround them. All of these modes of expression might also be described as the arts of everyday life. And as folklorist Del Himes once said, quote, "Folklorists believe that capacity for aesthetic experience, for shaping deeply felt values into meaningful form, is present in all communities and will find some means of expression among all." Within this framework, I turn to our topic tonight, folk and self-taught art, to consider how these terms may be viewed through the lens of folklore as categories with substance and power. Several renowned folklorists have worked on this and devoted much of their last 50 years to refining these concepts through deep ethnographic fieldwork with artists and artistic communities across cultures and geographies. So I'm just going to start back in 1989, not go too far, but in 1989, addressing debates across art worlds, academic institutions, and the commercial marketplace, esteemed folklorist Henry Glassy wrote in this book, a catalog, quote, "The traits customarily used to characterize folk art, the absence of education, individuality, sophistication, and will, all derive from the adoption of an external point of view. The difference between folk and fine art is more a matter of convention, of academic convention, of differences in scholarly traditions of discourse and approach, than it is a difference in phenomena. Art differs as cultures differ, but as for definitions, you will be left with this and not more. Folk art is the fine art of other people. Fine art is our folk art. Identifying historic hierarchies of class and culture that have nurtured insider and outsider perspectives on what constitutes art, he declares that fine art is the tradition of painting and sculpture in the West, not the tradition, but one among many of the world's fine traditions of art, one regional tradition, not a universal standard. Fine and folk art are both traditional, referring to the incorporation of community aesthetics, practices, and values into one's creation, explicitly or not. And even more, fine art and folk art are in fact quite similar in process. They're just different in culture, taste, and value. Glassie writes that, quote, "The work and goals of the Turkish weaver and the Renaissance painter are at base the same. They are only different in who consumes them, and that is, if rich people consume them, they are fine, but if poor people consume them, they are folk." After 50 years of folkloristic research in artistic communities across Ireland, Turkey, Bangladesh, Japan, Nigeria, Brazil, and all across the US, Glassie concludes that the key to all of this art is sincerity, effort, commitment, and dedication. And here I'm just going to show you a few images, very few, from his work. This is Prince Twin 77, a Nigerian artist, Nigerian and American artist. These is just two pots from communities in the American South with which he has done a great amount of field work. And again, ceramic traditions in Turkey. "Really, art is art," he writes, "and all art is self-taught. Quote, one can be taught craft techniques in a particular tradition, but art rises from the self. All art is self-taught." Thus, Glassie questions the centrality of the category called fine art by recognizing factors that have given it weight, that it has been constructed, quote, "constructed by scholars with an historical interest, conditioned by the taste of wealthy patrons, and centered on developments in painting and sculpture, the methods favored by men in Europe and the European Americas." Distinguished folklorist Barbara Kirshenblatt Gimlet has also critiqued categorical labels by examining different definitions of art more broadly. Having also devoted the last 50 years to studying creative performances in everyday life in her teaching, research, and museum curation, she declares that if by aesthetics one means beauty, virtuosity, and skill, and when one says that, one is referring to materials and execution, and particularly to practices that are learned within a fine art tradition in an institutional setting with accreditation, that's a very specific definition of what art is. But if you take my approach, which has to do with giving value to form, that form may or may not be beautiful. It may or may not be virtuosic. It may or may not be an exemplar of craft, but meaningful form and value, for me, are at the heart of what art is. So we must ask again, who determines what is beautiful or virtuosic? We return to the issue of internal and external positions, different cultural standards and values, the necessity of cultural relativism and the labeling of art or not, fine, folk, or otherwise. Barbara Kirshenblatt Gimlet identifies herself as a curator of vernacular arts and sees no reason why art must be made strictly for beauty rather than for utilitarian purpose. All the language of universality, she says, that standards are absolute and not relative, that they are not culturally or historically determined, that great art transcends time and place and outlasts all others, all of that is an architecture to sustain the status quo. She argues that we must recognize art for the values that shape it, rather than the labels for which it is valued. Anthropologist Johann Fabian believes that attention to genre ultimately means attending to generation, that is, the making of knowledge. Creating categories is a production of knowledge. However, folklorist and curator of textiles and dress at the Museum of International Folk Art, Carrie Hertz, recognizes how it actually can restrict understanding. She illustrates what she calls, quote, the tyranny of the genre and its intellectual limits through her current exhibition work on the artwork of Policarpio Valencia, whose artwork in her museum's collection has rarely been shown, as the museum has struggled with how to talk about it, not seeing it fit into a recognizable genre or tradition. Valencia's work uses recycled domestic textiles, patched and pieced together, and then covered with embroidered text discussing morality, mortality, and divine justice in a New Mexican dialect Spanish. Through social, cultural, historical, geographical, religious, and material contextualization, Hertz's folkloristic approach to understanding this artwork highlights how artistic traditions emerge and develop over time through the unique contributions of individuals. She says, you gain nothing by understanding him as outside anything except romantic, exotic objectification. The last voice I add to this chorus is that of eminent folklorist Bernie Herman, who has spent his career closely studying the place and power of material culture in people's imaginations, dreams, and lived experiences. Like Glassy, Kirschenblatt, Gimlet, and Hertz, Herman asserts that, quote, our encounters with art are overly determined by uncontested critical categories, and that categories are manifestations of presumed cultural power. In his forthcoming book, Troublesome Things, he closely studies a set of artworks that could be and have been described variously as fine art, folk art, self-taught art, and outsider art. But instead of working within these bounds to find meaning and form, Herman explores them as objects that move across bounds through their affective natures, as materials that stir emotional, bodily, and sensory experience. And as such, he titles his chapters, each focusing on one artwork. Number 1, ambient things. 2, transparent things. 3, veiled things. 4, translated things. 5, uncertain things. And 6, troubling things. What can these words tell us that fine and folk or self-taught cannot? Herman's approach to understanding the meaning and power of these artworks is to understand the work that these objects do in the world in relation to the people and environments of their making and use. He identifies these troublesome things by looking at the borders of categories. These objects, he writes, are troublesome in the sense that they disrupt the comforts of convention. How can we conceptualize and speak about artwork in new ways that allow for the everyday complexities of their creation, their presence, their consumption, and their lasting power to both affirm and challenge our assumptions about them? Categories will always be relational and comparative, working with and against each other, Carrie Hertz explains. But she recognizes a major sea change in Western thought propelled by the information age. She says we're finally emerging out of the thinking conditioned by the Industrial Revolution and liberalism that essentially made the concept of handicraft, folk, and traditional art necessary in the first place. All of our naturalized categories seem to be in question right now, from gender to race to economic and political systems and cultural canons. If so, how might we nurture new ways of looking at human creativity free of assumed limits and labels? And how might we value artwork from the inside out, from the ground up, and for the work it does across borders rather than within them? So I'm going to end there and welcome up our next speaker, Kinshasa Conwell. Thank you.
Good evening. I would say you look beautiful, but I can't see you, so I'll just assume. I want to first thank my beautiful escort. Matt Arnett is part of why I'm here in many ways, as is Lonnie Holly and Matt's late dad, Bill, because Bill and Matt and Paul and Lonnie were all about my introduction to this work, particularly when it comes to the art part of the work. I met them, Lonnie and I think it's probably 30 years ago, but we're not sure. when Bill descended upon the Studio Museum in Harlem and declared his presence and his need to see me. Now, in those days, you can just come to museums, kind of like in the South when you go by somebody's house. You just roll up in the car and you were there. And you know, sometimes your parents would say, stay in the car, but sometimes you would just get out of the car anyway. So, Matthew Teitelbaum, I don't know if you just let people roll up to this museum and walk in, but at the Studio Museum in the late 80s, early 90s, people would show up. Sometimes they'd want to see me. Unfortunately, Denzel Washington didn't ask to see me, but his presence was reported to me. Don't you know? But this is a reunion for me in many ways. And I want to thank Michael for inviting me to this. And we have not known each other a long time, but I feel like we've known each other forever. Just sitting next to each other at an insider gathering at the Whitney Museum of American Art, we struck up a conversation, and he said casually, I'm going to be doing a seminar, a symposium. Might you be interested? I said, sure, thinking he'll be like everyone else. He'll never call me back. But he called me back, and he kept calling me. I'm like, Michael, what do you want? I want you to come to Boston. I probably have not been in Boston really for as long as I have not seen Lonnie and the Arnett family. And we could talk about that in the Q&A. But no, I love Boston. I do. But I do love Matthew Teitelbaum, and I do love Kristen, and I do love everyone here because they've been so gracious to me. But when Erica was talking, I thought, this is about intellectual generosity. And when the great Gabrielle just spoke, I'm so glad I didn't know in advance, well in advance, that she was going to precede me. Because I would have said, Michael, I'm not coming. But I could say that about Jory as well, and I could say that about Lonnie, except I love Lonnie so much, it's hard not to come if he's going to be there. So, but when I heard Matthew talking about the intent of the wonderful MFA and what you all are trying to do, I thought, that does not sound like what museums used to talk about when we were members of the Association of Art Museum Directors, or the AAMD, that distinguished body of art museum directors. And it was not done. One did not talk about that kind of openness and generosity. Often people turn their noses up to this art. What is this? It's not blah, 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 blah. Fill in the blank. Some great American, some great European. But in the years that have gone on, forward-looking directors like Matthew and curators like Michael and others who were actually working on this for years, even though she looks very young, Gabrielle, were doing this. And then great names that I want to call up, like the great John Michael Vlach, who was one of the great thinkers about folk art. And of course, the living, thank God for telling me that he's still with us, the great William Ferris, Bill Ferris, one of the most generous and intellectually generous people you want to meet. So this is a reunion, and this is about a journey, as Michael said I would talk about. So, there it is. That's so you remember who I am. That's me. And thanks to the great Nate, I was able to get that slide done. So that's who I am. And this is the fun part, nomenclature. When I was on the museum panel of the New York State Council on the Arts, in those days in New York, all museums were talked about in the same panel. So art museums, science museum, history museums, but many of the museums were either history or art. So that's where I first heard the name Robert Chenal. And I thought, okay, who is he? Well, that's when they started talking about nomenclature, and all the history museums talked about it, but we in the art museum field did not talk about it. We did not talk about classifying art by the size, the shape, the dimension. We did talk about provenance because it sounded so, erudite, but we did not talk about the other things that mark what we call in the museum field, do we still call that the tombstone that is in cataloging? But that the American Association of State and Local History is correct. It is used in history museums around this country a lot, and it's important, and nomenclature becomes a way to know something, because if you name it, at least you think. You name it, you know it. But then when we think of one of the greatest contemporary artists in America today, I declare, Simone Lee, who stormed Venice. I was not there, but I heard from all my friends. And with your neighbor from the ICA Boston, who took her show to Venice and just changed everyone's life. That show, in a certain iteration, came to the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden of my former general institution, the Smithsonian. And so I got this quote from her, which I love. In order to tell the truth, you need to invent what might be missing from the archive, to collapse time, to concern yourself with issues of scale, to formally move things around in a way that reveals something more true than fact. And I think what everyone's been talking about, and we'll talk about, is what is more true than fact? Because truth and fact, as you all know, because I know you know, is very different. And if you didn't know, now you know, to quote a certain person in the popular world. But when I came upon this jug, one of the last pieces in the exhibition, I stopped in my tracks. And art that makes me stop in my tracks is my favorite kind of art, that bombards me with memory and with meaning. And I thought, Dave the Potter, I thought the so-called grotesque jug, I thought Africa, and there was a tour going on. A beautiful young woman was giving the tour, and I just stepped from the edges around, and she was doing a marvelous job because she was eliciting from her little tribe of listeners what they thought about the work. And beautiful thoughts were coming out, not unfettered by what they were supposed to say about it. And I jumped in to talk about this, and we had just a marvelous conversation. But you know that she is, Simone, connected to not only Dave the Potter, but all the artists that Gabrielle showed, and probably some of the other artists we'll talk about and that you will see. And she didn't have to categorize this to know, is it art, is it important? She knew. This is a brief history of time, my friends. This is about, in the so-called formal African-American art world, how this work began to wend its way in. And like anything that is irresistible, after a certain time, you wear people down. They can't ignore it. But from the earliest times, people like James A. Porter, Elaine Locke, and years later, the great late David Driscoll, always included art by people like William Edmondson in their exhibitions, because they didn't stop to say, is this worthy? They knew it was art, and they knew by that very nature it was worthy. But Porter's book, for a while, was one of the few books we, studying any art by black people, had to look to. You'd go to the library, there was nothing there. So even though Edmondson and others had early attention, were in important galleries, there was not much documentation of this work. So when you wanted to write about it or talk about it, you had no place. But people like Porter, who founded the art gallery at Howard University, were the ones you could turn to, because there was that book, there were those pages, there was the background that was not only where and when these people were born, but what they were talking about. Now, Porter and Elaine Locke, the great intellectual, Rhodes Scholar, author of The New Negro, also, and particularly Locke, did a little bit of finger-wagging, because they embraced this work by telling you there's something intrinsic in it that is good, but we can't quite name it because it does not fit into categories. But they knew it was important because they had eyes to see. And then, of course, David Driscoll probably was the first African-American artist and art historian who broke through places like the LA County Museum of Art and other major museums around this country and brought all art by black artists into a larger world. And if you go through the archives of the LA Times, the New York Times, and eventually the art magazines, you'll see amazing exhibitions. Who knew these artists existed? You know, and by the time David did his shows, many of them were gone on to the larger life, but they hadn't been heard of. Something that has haunted me in my career in museums as I sat on panels and people had never heard of fill in the blank. And then there was the famous Black Folk Art in America exhibition, which roiled the art museum world and brought record visitors to the Corcoran and eventually to museums around the country, Jane Livingston and John Beardsley. There was another person who wrote for that book that was the companion to the exhibition, Regina Perry. Not that I can see you, but how many people know her name? Of course the front row does. Put your hands down. But how many people in rows beyond the front row? Oh, look at you. You go ahead on. All right. And see, that is an analog to this larger problem, yes? This was the first African American, even before the great Barry Gaither, who was a companion here for many years to the MFA and was the only reason some of us allowed the MFA to stand. We said, all right, Barry likes it, it must be good. But a lot of other museums weren't smart enough to know that it needed to be validated by somebody we trusted. And so when Barry said, MFA special, we said, it's cool. I didn't know, and I thought I knew everything, right? Regina Perry was a special consultant to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Who knew that? She brought in collections. She wrote for the Metropolitan Museum, and she validated the work of black artists and not just black artists. Well, she was also a writer for that catalog. She was also the primary author of Free Within Ourselves, which was from the Smithsonian, art from the collection of what was then called the National Museum of American Art, which now is SAM, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And Dr. Perry was someone who talked about every kind of artist and who talked a lot about what was mostly then called, I think, folk art. But she is still with us and has done brilliant work. But her lack of notoriety mirrors the lack of notoriety of our artists who should be better known. But that is the truncated, that is the hierarchical world in which this work is shown publicly. It has nothing to do with the value of Lonnie Holly as one of the most brilliant artists and human beings you want to know. It has to do with our own perception. And my colleagues have talked about this more eloquently than I ever could. And then here's a couple other places. I want to say John Michael Vlach. Mancha Diawara of NYU said, in the tradition in Mali, you say someone's name 3 times. And you also, as you know, if someone says your name, even if you've gone on, you are still here. And he lives with us. So that decorative arts, the sweetgrass basket, the grotesque jug, all of that, a lot of us learned that from him. And then testimony. This was a collection of Ron and June Shelp. And I wrote for the book's full disclosure. But that, as Jane Livingston and John Beardsley show, did not get wide resonance in precincts other than the already initiated. And if you look up, I saw a review I'd never seen where someone slammed Jane Livingston and said, great exhibition, worst catalog ever done. I'm like, really, are you sure it's the worst? I think I have others that they're in my collection, I can show you. Now this is where I have to do my disclosure, as we say in Washington, full disclosure. We don't really mean full disclosure, but we mean. But thanks to Bill and his dad, thanks to Bill, the dad, and my friend Matt and his brother Paul, I learned about this art. I met Lonnie, I met Charlie, Lucas. So Souls Grown Deep, this great book, which is the foundation and its knowledge, the artist, of this Souls Grown Deep Foundation, and I have just recently joined that board. So I want you to know I did this presentation before I got elected to the board 2 days ago. So But I do want to disclose that, as we do in Washington. And next to the last slide is this. William Edmondson was probably one of the artists that we first knew about, because he was in Porter's book. He was in, I believe MoMA. And so we weren't sure what all of his work meant, but we just knew it was stunning. And that's the thing for me. Did it knock me off my feet? There's shows that I saw at LA County Museum of Art when I was there years ago. I still remember them, and I remember exactly what they looked like because it got me right here. And when the great Alexis Smith, Joyce Kozloff and I talked about her in social media, I said, did she do something called Scheherazade? She said, yes, she did. I remembered it, 30 years later. The great Betty Saar, Indigo Mercy. Betty Saar has a quote, which I don't have in front of me, but she talks about never having the stroke for mainstream, never wanting to be considered in the mainstream. And she, more than most artists, more than many artists, except we know, Jory, in LA, it's all about artists you will talk about and ones we love and people that I know. I was actually in an exhibition with Betty Saar. She went on to become Betty Saar, and I went on to go to museums. Okay. Don't judge me. Don't judge me. But there was a time when I made an honest living, my friends. These two works, thanks to dear Michael, I have two of my favorite artists, Bill Traylor, his work from 1939, Dog, and Gertrude Morgan, or Sister Gertrude, as we call her, New Jerusalem Choir, 1972, from the collection of the great Museum of Fine Arts. In the heart, in the soul. Please, if you don't already know, read about what Peter Morin, formerly of the Speed Museum, talked about when he talked about Bill Traylor. And at the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter if you think Bill Traylor's work reminds you of some postmodern work, or if it makes you think of Matisse's cutouts, or many of the many arguments that I had when the late Thomas McEvely, I think, was almost going to physically accost me. Don't talk about someone who can't defend himself, but I'm like, dude, it's okay, we don't have to agree. These people, are as good as anyone else. I said, I'm not fighting you. I said, but the point isn't whether they're as good as. The point is, what do they do? Can you find a way to talk about it? Can you find a way to embrace it on its own terms? And can you do, as I've finally done, surrender? Thank you. Thank you, my friend.
Hello. I'm going to take this remote. So thank you, Michael and the Lunder Institute, for cooking this evening up, and thank you all for joining us. I am going to talk about some of the same issues from a writer's point of view. As a reporter, I've been working for years now to make more space for coverage of women artists, LGBTQ artists, indigenous folk artists. But often I've found that to do so requires some adjustment on my part. A righting of the ship, if you will, of craftsmanship and what art forms we value. So I want to share a few examples with you so that together we can consider this question: how can we more effectively work against the reductive and often sexist and racist art versus craft divide that helps to keep so-called outsider artists on the outside? And I'm going to start by mentioning an article that I wrote for the New York Times about the 19th century artist David Drake, who made powerful, sometimes enormous pottery while still enslaved in South Carolina. There's been a lot of great scholarship on Drake in the last decade, including Michael's, and I had the chance to bring this to a wider audience through my coverage in the Times in the year 2021. This was before the Hear Me Now show that I hope you saw either at the Met or here. And I found when writing this feature that I had to confront stereotypes, not just about slavery, but also about the value of craft.
In essence, I was confronting these hierarchies of taste and value created by centuries of a white, male-dominated European art market that puts easel painting at the top and functional objects at the bottom. I made this a pyramid shape on purpose. We've all seen this hierarchy in action. You know, just look at the auctions and what commands top price, and how fine art, which is painting and sculpture, occupies the apex here. But I find it helpful to have a visual. So you start with painting and sculpture as historically, traditionally, in a Western European context, the most valuable. After that comes drawings and works on paper, if they're original, one of a kind. After that comes the prints, photographs, and other additioned multiple works. And then at the bottom, we have this catch-all category. Pottery, basketry, textiles, metalwork, any decorative functional objects, quilts you can think of. And that's what we call craft for the most part. Now, what I want to point out about this pyramid, about this division, is that these are not artist-driven categories. They are collecting categories. And yet they shape so much of how we speak and think about art, including some of the things I came up against when writing about David Drake, starting with what to call him. In collecting circles, in small-town auction catalogs, he was for a long time identified as Dave the Slave, which I find, dehumanizing. This shifted over years into Dave the Potter, which I find problematic because I think that's still infantilizing in some ways, making him seem like a friendly uncle instead of a fiercely talented artist. So I ended up in writing about him and following the practice of some art historians and referred to him by full name, David Drake. More importantly, I made it a point to refer to him only as an artist, the broadest possible category, not artisan, not potter, although that appeared in the headline, and certainly not craftsperson. Calling him an artist was, I felt, in keeping with the main point of my article about mainstream museum curators finally embracing this work. As the young curator Tim Burgard said, we have to think more seriously about objects like pottery, quilts, and the beautiful ironwork on balconies in New Orleans. If you don't, he said, you are never going to adequately embrace the history of women artists, artists of color, or enslaved artists. So a very different example of my trying to resist the art versus craft divide came in an article I wrote about Rose B. Simpson from Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico. How many here know her work? Since she did have a show in Boston not so long ago, where I had a choice of focus. Her figurative sculptures were what were landing her at these museum shows. But I had the chance to visit her studio in New Mexico. I've actually known her for many years. I've gotten to know her and her family a bit, and then visited her studio where I saw a wide range of artwork, including fabric work, including costumes, and what might be her most ambitious artwork yet, this lowrider car. She has transformed this car, her 1985 Chevy El Camino, by painting it she's transformed it inside and out, remade the interior with found objects, among other things. And then on the outside, she's painted these black-on-black abstract patterns in homage to another Pueblo artist, Maria Martinez. Simpson calls her car Maria. She considers Maria one of her most important works of art, and I followed her lead in that. So that became the beginning of my story, the focus of my story at first, no matter how low a lowrider might fall on this art market hierarchy that I just showed you. So that's a strategy that I would identify as a best practice of sort, following the artist's lead. If the artist calls a work a painting, like Mark Bradford does with all of his collages, it's a painting. If they call a car a work of art, it's a work of art. That artists are our most expansive and generous meaning makers. So that article on Rose Simpson led to a larger feature I did for W Magazine, of all places, about a group of indigenous artists, including Simpson and Diani Whitehawk, Nicholas Gallinen, Melissa Cody. Whitehawk is a Lakota artist from Minneapolis who makes exquisite and very laborious abstract paintings, you can see here, typically out of these long colored beads that mimic Lakota quill work. The quill work, if you don't know, and I think I only had a vague idea going into this, is the threading of hollow porcupine quills into patterns to embellish clothes, moccasins, and more. And it was especially popular with many different tribes, a range of tribes, before the arrival of beads. So I'm a white woman of European descent, a tourist in many ways, covering Native artists and covering these artists who were from different geographic regions, different tribes, and their communities. I honestly didn't know if I could or should take this assignment, so I ended up talking to the artist at great length ahead of writing the story. I asked Diani, don't you think a Native writer should be doing this instead? She pretty much said yes, but that I was a kind of necessary step. I heard the phrase necessary evil. I was a necessary step along the way, and that she saw my writing as playing an important role towards that end. So I decided to go ahead with her help and the help of other artists, and with a commitment from the magazine that they would give me the expense account needed to visit each of these artists in person, so I could see them in their studios, in their communities. I was not going to phone this one in and get a better sense of their roots. In the process, I asked the artists to tell me what they thought the biggest misperception of their work is. What I heard from Whitehawk was surprising. She said that too many people describe her work as innovative, taking age-old traditions from her ancestors and revitalizing them for the 21st century. Her work is always, she said, framed as an advance or an innovation, what Silicon Valley would call a disruption, while she sees it instead as a continuation of her indigenous culture, which itself was inventive. So just think about the resourcefulness of Lakota quill work, or the inventiveness of Navajo Germantown weaving, a weaving form invented in the 1860s during their internment at Fort Sumner, when the Navajo peoples did not have resources to weave except for some military-issued, commercially made blankets from Germantown, Pennsylvania. So while incarcerated, Navajo peoples took these blankets apart for their threads, so they could reweave them in their own styles, and they became hybrid styles because it was Navajo peoples from different areas working together. This kind of inventiveness, Germantown-style weaving, is the context for work being made today by Melissa Cody, a fourth-generation Navajo weaver, whose work you can see here. So what if you go back to the traditional art market hierarchy and infuse it with those sort of values, assigning creativity and innovation to the craft category at the bottom, instead of where it's typically assumed to be, the fine art category at top? How would this art market hierarchy begin to crumble if you recognized craft traditions like weaving and metalwork as the site of serious, rigorous, and wildly inventive innovation? So lastly, I want to talk about the great tradition of assemblage art in Los Angeles, which started most visibly with Simon Rudia, the Italian immigrant who devoted himself for decades to building the Watts Towers by hand, out of scavenged materials like steel, broken glass, pottery, and shells. Over the years, I've had the good fortune of being able to cover this tradition, starting with Rudia and continuing through artists like Noah Purifoy and John Outerbridge, shown here. Most recently, I did a report tied to the Hammer Museum Biennial made in LA on a new generation of assemblage artists working in Southern California today. Assemblage, as I see it, has at least two main roots in the 20th century, probably more, the historical European avant-gardes, especially Dada and Kirchwitters, and also the yard art of the American South, most closely associated with Black artists. Today, I see artists drawing freely from both of those traditions, both strains, along with Bay Area funk and the work of influential Black artists who lived in LA in the 1960s and 70s, Purifoy, Outerbridge, and Betty Saar especially. Which brings me to a question I would like to pose about self-taught artists going forward. We think of self-taught artists as those excluded from the systems, including educational, that specialize in producing artists. But what happens when self-taught artists take over or start institutions of their own to create educational opportunities for later generations? And that is what happened with Noah Purifoy and John Outerbridge both. They were both early in their careers self-taught to some degree, but that changed. Purifoy became the first Black artist to enroll at Chouinard in 1953, and Outerbridge, after his time in the US Army, went to art school in Chicago in the 50s while working as a bus driver. Once these artists settled into LA, they changed the way assemblage developed there in LA, in large part through the Watts Towers Art Center, where they showed their own work, promoted other artists, colleagues, taught classes, and more. Purifoy also created an outdoor museum in Joshua Tree where his work could be seen by others. So by now, we're in the year 2024, you have multiple generations who have benefited from trips to the desert to see Purifoy and his installations, his sculptures, made out of decommissioned toilets. These were the artists I talked to for that story, the palm fronds and assemblage art story in the New York Times. And here are some of the artists in that article. Looking at this art, can you tell who is self-taught and who went to Yale for their MFA? You can play a little game with me. Esteban Ramon Perez to the left and Teresa Tolliver to the right of this pairing. And here we have Miller Robinson to the left and Maria Maya to the right. And here we have the work of Chiffon Thomas. So Chiffon Thomas is a Black, queer, trans artist who grew up on the south side of Chicago with very limited access to art education. But he ended up going to Yale for his MFA, where he made this work with salvaged wood from colonial houses that he said reeked of privilege. So these are the balustrades and other parts of the houses. Maria Maya, whose work you just saw on the previous slide, is an artist of Samoan and Mexican ancestry who grew up in Long Beach and works with palm fronds. She taught herself how to weave them. You can see it right behind her. She's sitting here in her backyard. She scavenged the palm fronds from throughout Los Angeles, where you have, if you've spent any time in Los Angeles, you know how treacherous it is to drive there, not just because of the drivers, but the palm fronds in the streets. She takes palm fronds that have fallen down, also that need palm trees that need pruning. She takes the fronds and she weaves them together. She taught herself how to weave in a loosely Polynesian style. So she's an artist who doesn't have a BFA or an MFA of any kind. She's self-taught for the most part, but she also worked for several years in film production and costume and set design. So is Maria Maya an example of an outsider artist and Chiffon Thomas an insider, or vice versa? For these artists, the category of self-taught or outsider art proves much less relevant than the tradition of assemblage, or assemblage, as they'll say, to give it more American ring. The history of assemblage and the artist's particular choice of vernacular materials is, I believe, the more meaningful lens through which to view their work. And this approach begins to change how we think about Watts Towers, too. the more you see work by a young generation of assemblage artists showing up in biennials, galleries, and museums, the more that Watts Towers, long seen as a prime example of outsider art, begins to look, well, less eccentric and more central. So now, over 100 years after Simon Rodia started his building, Watts Towers can be seen as both outsider and insider art, occupying the very core of what matters to artists today, namely ideas of recycling and upcycling, notions of resourcefulness, a commitment to resourcefulness, and to making work by hand, bit by bit, that is grounded in their community. And you get to that point by paying attention to the methods, materials, and values of the artists, not the collecting categories. And I'm going to leave you with this slide while I invite Lonnie Hawley, the great Lonnie Hawley, to come up and finish our presentations for tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. It makes you wonder. Here you are, an artist, and you find out that you're an artist. When you find out that you're an artist, and you go to institutions of art, these institutions are standing out as some of this planet's greatest institutions to offer you identification of what humans have created that we call art. You go through these institutions and you look at what human brains had allowed their thoughts to be manifested into. I am an artist, and I am an American artist. The reason why I stand on that firmly is because everywhere I go around this planet, everything I've seen since I was studying National Geographics, looking at the pictorial part of encyclopedias, earlier pictorial images that had came out of our development as humans, all the way back to now some of the caves that have this soot are either where the humans had put their hands in the ash or into whatever they were and made images, scratched and did. And then we come to a term of saying those were images of great art. My thing that I'm talking about here tonight is that we should not undercut our students that is acting as artists or using their talents and their skills to demonstrate maybe even what they have learned to do to make their fathers and their mothers and grandmothers and grandparents and great-grandparents proud of them, those that was living. Because there's not too much proudness that I can do in the cemetery except move the weeds in the bushes and tidy up the grave and maybe pick up on the tombstones and sit them up straight where others can identify that those humans once existed. But art is a thing that comes from our human existence to let others know that we existed. And I'm not trying to beg or plead for you all to say, well, he was a good speaker. Don't do that. Don't do that. Because if you can't believe in what I say, maybe you need to just get on up and walk on out of here. And maybe this is not for you. But I met William Arnett at a time when we were struggling to come up with a presentation that could stand out in America at a time when we were asked to let it be done. Sometimes you are asked to let something be done. And in order for our students, and not only our students, but our storage places to somehow open up their doors and unstorialize these great works of art that has been done by humans even younger than I am that have lived already and passed away. And nobody gave them any recognition. It just so happened that I'm standing here because I fought for recognition. And I didn't stop struggling. I remember Dr. King said, I've been to the mountaintop. And he was talking about getting somewhere where he could look over it and see others striving for the same sort of brain appreciation. Most of my ancestors were de-appreciated because there was no accountability for their brain actions. But if Master had said, I'll kill you if you learn to read or write, what you think Master would have did if he had known that we was doing art instead of reading and writing? I know if I walk away from the microphone, but I'm a person, I don't like to be still too long. Because we as artists, we was constantly running and moving. Someone like Thornton Dowell, if you know his work. I saw a wonderful old gentleman from Montgomery, Alabama, telling you nothing but the truth with a little small piece of paper and a pencil that he sharpened down to the nub. You all may not know what it took in order to get here. Mr. William Edmondson, moving those big old heavy pieces of stone, chipping at them all day long in America. In America. My thing is, if the truth can't make you cry, then to wrestle with the truth will make you die. The truth in America now should be that we are thankful for those people being recognized as artists in America. Because if they didn't do what they did, like Thurton Dowell or Purvis Young or Mary T. Smith, cutting tin with an axe, cutting galvanized tin with an axe. I met the blind man, Mr. Hawkins Bowen, blind, but yet and still making some art that will scare you. Everything ain't meant to be pretty. Everything ain't meant to be sugar-coated and painted all shiny and pretty. You needed someone like Joe Mentor to come along and take up your Tridus or take up your trash or your leftover metalworks and all of these other things. Everything had a spirit to it already. But when we picked it up and we allowed the spirit that we had, if that spirit was willing to allow us to put spirit back into something, put spirit back into something. Well, when somebody noticed it, they said, wow, that's got a spirit about it. That's got a wellness about it. That's got a meaning to heal about it. If art was meant to be therapy, then therapy, we got to let it be therapy. My thing, y'all heard my music. I thank you all for listening. I thank for you all for listening now. And I thank us for carrying on. But what we got to do is we got to bring it to an equalism. If art is art, let art be art. Thumbs up from Mother Universe. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I want to thank everyone for your attention and knowing that your presence here tonight validates in many ways this art form. So as I said, we don't have an hour worth of conversation, but the one question I want to ask each of my collaborators is, what is the one thing that you want the audience to take away about this genre we've been talking about tonight? The one thing, if they don't remember anything else that was talked about, the one thing you want them to take away. And we'll go.
I want them to take away that we mean business.
Outstanding, excellent.
Thank you, Lon. Jory?
One thing I think you could probably gather from my talk that I really think the categories themselves come from other places. I mean, I think you said it as well, that the category of self-taught and outsider art are not coming from the artists, and that the artists artists I know today are creating things that put those categories to shame.
I can add. I would boil it down to think about, someone said that for there to be folk art, there has to be art that isn't folk. So you have to think about these categories always in relation to everything around them. And if we could start from another place, as I said earlier, thinking about form and value, thinking about art as form that has value shaped into form, that's a bottom-up way of thinking. And it originates with the maker. And I think we all have to learn. We have to be listeners and learn how to rethink these material expressions.
Thank you so much. Kinshasa, close us out.
You haven't known me long, but you know I can never say one thing. Why say one thing when you can say 100? This is the lesson for me is, let's make the next iterations of these symposia be about the work only, not the categories, not the nomenclature, except whatever you do, bring back Lonnie Holly, okay? Whatever you do.
So I'd like to thank everyone tonight for attending. Your presence is what makes this thing work. And I'd like to close out with a quote from a Danish philosopher and theologian, Søren Kierkegaard. And he said that everyone is great according to the magnitude of what they strive with. And we strove tonight to expand the categories and the boundaries of American art to be more inclusive for all of us and everyone. Thank you.